I stepped into the wrong carriage on the night I was meant to disappear forever. And in doing so, I stumbled into a fate far stranger and more magnificent than any I could have designed for myself. They say that destiny does not knock twice, but I have come to believe that sometimes it simply waits in the dark, disguised as a mistake, until we are desperate enough to recognize it. The rain had been falling for hours by the time I fled my father's house, clutching nothing but a small valise and the tattered remnants of my dignity. My name is Theodora Blackwell, and on that October evening in 1847, I was 23 years old, unmarried, and running from a man who believed he had purchased me along with my father's debts. Mr. Cornelius Fitch, a moneylender with cold eyes and colder hands, had presented himself at our door that morning with a marriage contract already signed by my father. A man so broken by gambling and failed investments that he had ceased to see me as his daughter and begun to see me only as currency. I had begged. I had wept. I had thrown myself at my mother's feet, only to watch her turn away, her silence a verdict more final than any words. By nightfall, I understood that there would be no rescue, no intervention, no miracle delivered by family loyalty. If I wished to save myself, I would have to do it alone. The coaching inn at the edge of Whitmore was chaos when I arrived. My boots soaked through, my traveling cloak heavy with rain. Carriages stood in the muddy yard, their horses stamping and snorting against the downpour, and servants shouted to one another through the storm. I had enough coin for passage to my aunt's house in Dorset, a woman I had not seen in 7 years, but who represented my only hope of refuge. I pushed through the crowd, searching for the public coach, my heart hammering against my ribs with every passing second. I found what I believed to be the correct carriage, a dark shape looming against the sheets of rain, and I wrenched open the door without ceremony. I threw myself inside, gasping, water streaming from my hair and pooling on the velvet seat beneath me. Only when the door slammed shut behind me did I realize I was not alone. A woman sat across from me in the darkness, perfectly still, watching me with eyes that gleamed like polished jet in the faint light filtering through the rain-streaked window. She was perhaps 35, dressed in mourning silk, so fine it seemed to absorb the shadows around her, and her face bore the kind of aristocratic beauty that spoke of generations of careful breeding. She did not scream or recoil at my sudden appearance. She merely tilted her head, as though I were a curious species of bird that had blown in through an open window. "I am terribly sorry," I stammered, reaching for the door handle. "I thought this was the public coach to Dorset." "It is not," the woman replied. Her voice was low and measured, carrying the unmistakable accent of the London elite. "This is the private carriage of the Stanhope family. I am Lady Octavia Stanhope." I felt the blood drain from my face. The Stanhopes were one of the most powerful families in England. Their name appeared in every society paper, their scandals whispered about in drawing rooms from Cornwall to Edinburgh. The current Duke of Ashworth, Dorian Stanhope, was rumored to be a man of extraordinary coldness, a widower whose young wife had died under circumstances that polite society refused to discuss in detail. I had stumbled into precisely the sort of world I had spent my entire life observing from a distance, separated by the unbridgeable chasm of class and fortune. "Forgive me," I said again, fumbling with the door. "I will leave at once." But Lady Octavia raised one gloved hand, and something in the gesture made me pause. "Wait," she said. She leaned forward, studying my face with an intensity that made me feel as though she were reading the secrets written on my bones. "You are running from something, or someone." It was not a question. I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. Outside, the rain continued its assault against the carriage roof, and I became aware that the vehicle had begun to move. The driver, apparently unaware of my intrusion, had urged the horses forward into the storm. "Please," I said, desperation creeping into my voice, "I cannot stay here. I must return to the inn. There has been a terrible mistake." "Perhaps," Lady Octavia said, and a strange smile crossed her lips. Or perhaps not. She gestured to the seat beside me. Sit. Dry yourself. You look as though you have been swimming in the Thames. I should have insisted. I should have pounded on the roof and demanded the driver stop. But the warmth of the carriage was seeping into my frozen limbs, and the promise of even a momentary reprieve from the storm proved too tempting to refuse. I sank back against the seat, clutching my sodden valise to my chest like a shield. Lady Octavia continued to watch me, her dark eyes missing nothing. After a long moment, she spoke again. You have the bearing of a gentlewoman, she observed, but your cloak is 2 seasons out of fashion, and your gloves are mended. Your father was a man of means who has lost his fortune. You are fleeing an arranged marriage, almost certainly to a creditor, and you are utterly, desperately alone. Each word struck like a blow. I stared at her, unable to deny any of it, feeling myself laid bare before this stranger in her fine silk and jet mourning beads. How could you possibly know all that? I whispered. Because I have made a study of desperation, Lady Octavia replied. It is, after all, the currency in which my family trades. She paused, something shifting behind her eyes. Tell me your name. Theodora, I said. Theodora Blackwell. Miss Blackwell, she repeated, as though tasting the syllables. She was silent for a long moment, the carriage swaying gently as it made its way through the darkness. Then she leaned back against her seat, and her smile returned, sharper now, edged with calculation. Tell me, Miss Blackwell, she said, how would you like to earn £50,000? I laughed before I could stop myself. It was an absurd sound, high and brittle, born of exhaustion and disbelief. £50,000, I repeated. Madam, I do not know what game you are playing, but I assure you I am in no position to be the subject of anyone's amusement. I am not amused, Lady Octavia said. I am entirely serious. She leaned forward again, her gloved hands folded in her lap. My brother, the Duke of Ashworth, is required by the terms of our grandfather's will to marry before his 35th birthday, which falls in precisely 31 days. If he fails to do so, the estate, the title, and the fortune that accompanies them will pass to our cousin, a man of such profound moral corruption that the thought of him gaining control of Ravensmoor Hall makes me physically ill. I stared at her, trying to make sense of her words. And what has this to do with me? Lady Octavia smiled. My brother refuses to marry. He has refused every eligible woman presented to him for the past 3 years. He is convinced that he is cursed, that any woman who agrees to become his wife will meet the same fate as his first duchess. She paused, and something flickered across her face, too quick for me to identify. You see, Miss Blackwell, Dorian's wife Lavinia died 2 years ago. The circumstances were tragic and complicated, and they have left my brother a broken man. I am sorry for his loss, I said carefully, still uncertain where this conversation was leading. So am I, Lady Octavia replied, but grief does not excuse stubbornness, and I will not watch our family legacy fall into the hands of a man who would sell the servants and burn the library for sport. She fixed me with her penetrating gaze. I need a bride for my brother, Miss Blackwell. A woman willing to enter into a marriage of pure convenience. A woman who will expect nothing from him emotionally, who will ask no questions about the past, and who will, in exchange for 1 year of her life, receive £50,000 upon the dissolution of the marriage or upon my brother's death, whichever comes first. The words hung in the air between us, impossible and tempting in equal measure. You cannot be serious, I said. I am rarely anything else, Lady Octavia replied. She tilted her head, studying me. You are precisely what I need. A woman of gentle birth, but reduced circumstances. A woman with no connections who might object, no family who might interfere. A woman who is, forgive me, desperate enough to accept a proposition that any sensible person would refuse. I should have been insulted. I should have demanded to be let out of the carriage that very instant. But Lady Octavia's words had found their mark, lodging themselves in the hollow place where my pride had once resided. "Even if I were willing to consider such an arrangement," I said slowly, "your brother would never agree. You said yourself he refuses to marry." Lady Octavia smiled again, and this time there was something almost triumphant in the expression. "Leave my brother to me," she said. "All I require from you is your consent. The rest, I assure you, I can manage." The carriage continued its journey through the storm, carrying me further from everything I had known and closer to a future I could not begin to imagine. I thought of the life I had left behind, the mother who had abandoned me to my fate, the father who had sold me without a second thought. I thought of Mr. Cornelius Fitch and his cold, possessive eyes, and I thought of £50,000, enough to never be dependent on anyone ever again. Lady Octavia waited in patient silence, as though she could see the calculations unfolding behind my eyes. "What would be required of me?" I asked at last. "Only that you play the part of a suitable bride," she replied. "You will live at Ravensmoor Hall as the Duchess of Ashworth. You will appear at my brother's side when society requires it. And you will ask no questions about Lavinia, about the circumstances of her death, or about any other matter my brother chooses to keep private." She paused. "In return, you will have a roof over your head, food on your table, and more money than you could earn in 10 lifetimes as a governess or companion. And after the year is complete, we shall arrange a quiet separation," Lady Octavia said, "an annulment if possible, certainly a generous settlement that will allow you to establish yourself anywhere you choose. You will be free, Miss Blackwell, truly free, for perhaps the first time in your life." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing against my chest. It was madness. It was the most reckless, dangerous, foolish thing I had ever contemplated. And yet, as I sat there in that swaying carriage, soaked to the bone and utterly without options, it seemed like the only path that led anywhere other than despair. I took a breath. "Very well," I said. "I accept." Lady Octavia's smile widened, and she extended her hand to me across the darkened space between us. "Welcome to the family, Your Grace," she said. Thus began my strange and impossible journey into the heart of the Stanhope household, and into the life of a man who would come to mean more to me than I ever could have anticipated. The storm broke sometime before dawn, and I woke to pale gray light filtering through the carriage windows and the sound of birdsong replacing the drumming of rain. Lady Octavia sat precisely where she had been when I fell asleep, and I wondered if she had moved at all during the night. "We will arrive at Ravensmoor within the hour," she said, as though sensing my wakefulness. "Before we do, there are matters we must discuss." She proceeded to outline the particulars of my new identity with the efficiency of a general preparing for battle. I was to be Miss Theodora Ashford, a distant cousin of a minor baronet whose family had fallen on hard times. My father had died of consumption, my mother of grief, and I had been living quietly in the north of England until Lady Octavia had discovered me during a charitable visit to a local parish. The story was plausible enough to withstand casual scrutiny, she assured me, and anyone who dug deeper would find their inquiries met with convenient dead ends. "What of my real family?" I asked. "My father will come looking for me eventually." "Let him," Lady Octavia replied. "By the time he discovers where you are, you will be the Duchess of Ashworth. Not even a desperate man would dare challenge the Stanhope name." She paused, something almost like compassion softening her features. "You need never see him again, Miss Blackwell. That is my promise to you." I nodded, swallowing against the tightness in my throat. Lady Octavia continued her instructions. I was to be demure, but not dull, pleasant, but not memorable. I was to allow Dorian to believe that I had agreed to this arrangement for the money alone, that my heart was as uninvolved as his own. Above all, I was to avoid any topic that might lead to discussion of the late Duchess, her death, or the rumors that had swirled around Ravensmoor Hall ever since. "My brother is not a cruel man," Lady Octavia said. choosing her words carefully. "But he is wounded, and wounded men can be dangerous. He may seem cold to you. He may seem unfeeling. But beneath that mask, Miss Blackwell, there is a heart that has been broken almost beyond repair. I ask only that you remember that, and that you treat him with whatever patience you can muster." "I will try," I said. "That is all I ask." The carriage crested a final hill, and suddenly the whole of Ravensmoor Hall lay spread before us, magnificent and terrible in the morning light. It was an ancient estate, built of grey stone that seemed to have grown from the earth itself, its towers and battlements climbing toward a sky still heavy with the remnants of the previous night's storm. Gardens stretched in all directions, formal and wild in equal measure, and beyond them I could see the dark edge of a forest that seemed to whisper of secrets and shadows. I pressed my face to the window, momentarily forgetting my anxiety in the face of such beauty. "It is something, is it not?" Lady Octavia said, and for the first time I heard genuine warmth in her voice. "We have held Ravensmoor for 300 years. My brother loves it as he loves nothing else in this world. It is magnificent," I breathed. Lady Octavia did not reply, but her silence seemed to carry agreement. The carriage swept up the long drive, past ancient oaks whose branches arched overhead like the ribs of some great cathedral, and came to a halt before the main entrance. Servants emerged to attend to the horses and luggage, moving with the silent efficiency of those who had performed these tasks countless times before. A butler appeared at the carriage door, his expression as carved and unreadable as the stone gargoyles that guarded the roofline. "Lady Octavia," he intoned, "welcome home." "Thank you, Pemberton," Lady Octavia replied, accepting his hand as she descended from the carriage. "This is Miss Ashford. She will be staying with us. Please see that the east guest chambers are prepared." "Very good, my lady," Pemberton replied, his gaze sliding over me with the barest flicker of curiosity before returning to its mask of professional neutrality. I followed Lady Octavia into the house, my sodden boots leaving damp prints on the immaculate marble floors. The entrance hall was vast and echoing, its walls lined with portraits of Stanhope's past, their painted eyes seeming to follow my progress with silent judgment. A great staircase rose before us, splitting into two wings that disappeared into shadow, and everywhere I looked there were signs of wealth so old and established that it had long ceased to require demonstration. Lady Octavia led me through a maze of corridors until we reached a small sitting room hung with rose-colored silk. "Wait here," she instructed. "I will speak to my brother. When I send for you, you will come to his study and we will conclude the negotiations." She paused at the door. "Do not wander. Ravensmoor has many rooms, and not all of them are welcoming to strangers." I nodded, too overwhelmed to argue, and sank into a chair as Lady Octavia departed. The waiting was interminable. I sat in that rose-colored room as the morning aged toward noon, watching dust motes drift through bars of pale sunlight, trying to imagine what Lady Octavia might be saying to her brother. Was he agreeing to this mad scheme? Was he refusing, as he had refused every other prospective bride? And if he refused, what would become of me? I had no answers, only questions, and they circled through my mind like crows around carrion. At last, a footman appeared in the doorway. "Miss Ashford," he said, "His Grace will see you now." I rose on unsteady legs and followed him through more corridors, up a flight of stairs, and finally to a pair of heavy oak doors bound in iron. The footman knocked once, then pushed them open and stepped aside. The Duke's study was a room of shadows and books. Shelves climbed toward the ceiling on every wall, laden with volumes bound in leather and vellum, and a great desk of dark wood stood before a window that overlooked the forest. Lady Octavia was seated in a chair to one side, her expression carefully neutral. And standing before the window, his back to me, was a figure that could only be Dorian Stanhope, the 6th Duke of Ashworth. He did not turn as I entered. He remained where he was, motionless, silhouetted against the gray light, and I had the strange impression that I was looking at a statue rather than a man. "So," he said at last. His voice was deep and cold, carrying none of the warmth that occasionally softened his sister's tone. "You are the woman my sister has chosen for me." "I am," I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. He turned then, and I saw his face for the first time. I do not know what I had expected. The rumors painted him as a monster, a man whose very presence could curdle milk and wither flowers. But the reality was far more unsettling than any monster could have been. Dorian Stanhope was beautiful, with the kind of severe, angular beauty that belonged in the paintings that lined his ancestors' halls. His hair was dark, nearly black, swept back from a high forehead, and his eyes were the color of winter ice, pale and piercing and utterly devoid of warmth. He was perhaps 34, tall and lean, dressed in impeccable black that emphasized the pallor of his skin. But it was not his beauty that arrested me. It was the sorrow that clung to him like a second skin, visible in the shadows beneath his eyes, in the tight line of his mouth, in the way he held himself as though bracing for a blow. This was not a man who had simply lost his wife. This was a man who had been hollowed out by grief, left walking through the world as a shell that bore only the faintest resemblance to who he had once been. "Miss Ashford," he said. He did not offer his hand or any other greeting. "My sister tells me you are willing to enter into a marriage of convenience. I am, Your Grace." He studied me for a long moment, his pale eyes traveling over my face, my figure, my worn traveling clothes. "She has explained the terms?" "She has." "And you accept them? No dowry, no romantic attachment, no expectations beyond a legal union that will satisfy the conditions of my grandfather's will?" I swallowed. "I do." A muscle twitched in his jaw, and for a moment I thought I saw something flicker behind those frozen eyes, gone too quickly to identify. "Very well," he said. He turned back toward the window, presenting me once again with the broad expanse of his back. "We will be married in 3 weeks. My sister will see to the arrangements. You will have everything you need." He paused. "We will not discuss my late wife. We will not discuss my past. We will maintain whatever facade society requires, and beyond that, I expect nothing from you and offer nothing in return." His words were a dismissal, clear and final, and I felt something within me bristle at his coldness. "As you wish, Your Grace," I said. He did not respond. Lady Octavia rose from her chair and took my arm, steering me gently but firmly toward the door. "Come," she murmured. "I will show you to your rooms." I allowed myself to be led away, but at the threshold I paused and looked back. The Duke stood exactly as I had left him, a solitary figure framed by the gray window, and for reasons I could not explain, my heart ached at the sight. 3 weeks, I thought. 3 weeks until I become the bride of a man who has forgotten how to feel. And God help me, I could not decide if that was a blessing or a curse. The days that followed passed in a blur of preparations and introductions. Lady Octavia proved as efficient as she had promised, arranging everything from the wedding ceremony to my wardrobe with the precision of a military campaign. Seamstresses arrived to measure me for gowns. Dancing masters were summoned to ensure I could waltz without embarrassing myself. A lady's maid named Prudence Whitmore was assigned to attend me, a thin, watchful woman of perhaps 50 who spoke little but observed everything. Through it all, I saw almost nothing of the Duke. He took his meals alone in his study. He rode out each morning before dawn and did not return until dusk. When our paths crossed in the corridors, he acknowledged me with the barest nod before continuing on his way. It was as though I were a piece of furniture that had been added to the household, noticed only when directly in his path. Lady Octavia assured me this was normal. Dorian was not always thus, she told me one afternoon, as we sat in the rose-colored parlor embroidering. Well, she was embroidering. I was making a mess of the linen in my lap. Before Lavinia, he was different. Not warm, precisely, but present, engaged with the world. "What happened to her?" I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "To his wife?" Lady Octavia's needle paused mid-stitch. "I told you," she said. "That subject is not to be discussed." "I know. But surely I should understand something of what I am walking into," the servants whisper. The whole of England whispers. "Is it not better that I hear the truth from you than piece together rumors from chambermaid gossip?" Lady Octavia was silent for a long moment. Then she set down her embroidery and fixed me with her penetrating gaze. "Lavinia Stanhope died of a fall," she said, "from the east tower of this house. Whether she fell or jumped, no one knows." She paused. There were those who suggested a third possibility, that she was pushed. The words hung in the air between us, terrible and heavy. "And was she?" I whispered. Lady Octavia's expression did not change. "No," she said firmly. "My brother was in London the night Lavinia died. A dozen witnesses can attest to his presence at Lord Hartington's ball. He did not push his wife. He was not even in the same county. Then why do people suspect him?" "Because he is cold," Lady Octavia replied. "Because he did not weep at her funeral. Because he locked himself away in this house and refused to see anyone for 6 months after her death." She sighed. "Grief takes many forms, Miss Ashford. My brother's form is silence, but society does not understand silence. Society requires tears and wailing and visible suffering. When Dorian offered none of those things, they concluded that he must have killed her. But the truth? The truth is that Lavinia was unhappy. She had been unhappy for a long time. The marriage was not a love match, it was an arrangement between our families, and she never forgave Dorian for failing to be the romantic hero she had dreamed of as a girl. She turned to other amusements to fill the void: parties, gambling, and eventually other men. Lady Octavia spoke the words without apparent emotion, but I saw her fingers tighten on the fabric in her lap. "Dorian discovered her affair the summer before she died," she continued. "He confronted her. There was a terrible argument. After that, they lived as strangers under the same roof. And then, one October night, Lavinia went up to the East Tower, and she did not come back down." I sat in silence, absorbing this information. It was both better and worse than I had imagined. The Duke had not killed his wife, but he had not saved her either. He had watched her drown in her own unhappiness and done nothing. Was that a crime? Was that a sin? Or was it simply the inevitable consequence of two people trapped in a marriage neither of them had chosen? "You must understand," Lady Octavia said, her voice softer now, "that my brother blames himself. Not for pushing her, but for failing to see how deep her despair had become. He believes that if he had been a better husband, if he had loved her the way she wanted to be loved, she would still be alive. That guilt is what has turned him into the man you see today." I thought of the figure at the window, silhouetted against the gray light, and I understood. "He is punishing himself," I said. "Yes," Lady Octavia agreed, "and he has been punishing himself for 2 years. I had hoped that time would ease his suffering, but instead it has only hardened it." She looked at me with something that might have been hope. "Perhaps you can help him, Miss Ashford. Perhaps your presence will remind him that life continues, that there is still goodness in the world, still reasons to emerge from the shadows." "I do not see how I could accomplish such a thing," I said honestly. "He barely acknowledges my existence." Lady Octavia smiled faintly. "Give it time," she said. "Ravensmore has a way of working on people. And beneath all that ice, my brother still has a heart. Someone simply needs to find it." I did not tell her that I had no intention of searching for the Duke's heart. I was here for £50,000 and my freedom, nothing more. Whatever sorrows he carried were his own concern. But even as I thought it, I knew that I was lying to myself. The wedding took place on a gray November morning, with rain threatening at the edges of the sky, and a congregation consisting primarily of servants and a handful of distant relations who had come more out of curiosity than affection. I wore a gown of ivory silk that Lady Octavia had selected, my hair arranged in an elaborate style that made me feel like a stranger in my own body. The Duke wore black, as he always did, and his expression throughout the ceremony was one of stoic endurance. I repeated my vows in a voice that did not shake. I allowed him to slide a ring of gold and sapphires onto my finger. When the vicar pronounced us man and wife, the Duke leaned down and pressed his lips to my cheek in the briefest approximation of a kiss. "It is done," he murmured against my skin. And just like that, I was the Duchess of Ashworth. The wedding breakfast was a subdued affair, attended only by Lady Octavia and a handful of others whose names I immediately forgot. The Duke sat at the head of the table, silent and untouchable, while I sat at its foot, smiling and nodding and saying all the correct things because Lady Octavia had drilled them into me over the previous weeks. By early afternoon, the guests had departed, and I found myself alone in my new chambers, staring at the enormous four-poster bed that dominated the room. There was a connecting door to the Duke's chambers, but it remained firmly closed. I did not expect him to open it. We had agreed on the terms of our arrangement, and those terms did not include any form of marital intimacy. And yet, as I stood there in my ivory gown, listening to the rain that had finally begun to fall, I felt an unexpected pang of loneliness. I was married. I was a duchess. I was mistress of one of the great estates of England, and I had never felt more alone in my entire life. The weeks that followed settled into a routine of elegant emptiness. I breakfasted alone. I walked the grounds with Lady Octavia as my guide, learning the names of the gardens and the histories of the outbuildings. I sat for fittings and attended to correspondence and played the pianoforte in the music room while rain streaked the windows. And I saw my husband at dinner each evening, where we sat at opposite ends of a table that could seat 30 and exchanged precisely enough words to satisfy the requirements of basic civility. "How was your day, Your Grace?" I would ask. "Uneventful," he would reply. And that was all. It might have continued thus indefinitely, both of us moving through our separate lives like ships passing in the night, had it not been for what happened on the evening of the winter ball. Lady Octavia had arranged the event as my formal introduction to local society, an occasion for the new Duchess to meet her neighbors and demonstrate that the rumors about her reclusive husband were greatly exaggerated. Every noble family within 50 miles had been invited, and the great ballroom of Ravensmoor Hall had been opened for the first time in 3 years, its chandeliers polished until they blazed like fallen stars. I wore a gown of midnight blue that brought out the color of my eyes and my grandmother's pearls, the only valuable thing I had managed to rescue from my father's house. Lady Octavia had coached me on names and faces and the intricate web of alliances and grudges that define the local aristocracy, and I felt as prepared as I was ever likely to be. But I was not prepared for the way the Duke looked when he entered the ballroom. He was still dressed in black, as always, but his coat was cut to perfection and his dark hair was swept back to reveal the strong lines of his face. For the first time since our wedding, he looked like what he was, a man of power and position, commanding and impossibly elegant. When he offered me his arm to open the dancing, I took it with fingers that trembled slightly, and I wondered if he could feel my pulse racing through the fabric of my gloves. "You look well," he said, as we took our places for the waltz. "Thank you, Your Grace." The music began, and we began to move. I had always been a passable dancer, but dancing with the Duke was something else entirely. He led with effortless authority, his hand firm at my waist, his pale eyes fixed on some point over my shoulder. We swept across the floor in perfect time, and I was acutely aware of every place where his body touched mine, of the scent of sandalwood and cedar that clung to his coat, of the way the candlelight played across the planes of his face. "You are staring," he said without looking at me. I blushed and dropped my gaze. "Forgive me. I was simply thinking how well you dance." A sound escaped him, something that might almost have been a laugh. Lavinia hated dancing, he said. I stopped practicing after we married. It was the first time he had mentioned her name to me, and I felt the weight of it settle between us like a stone dropped into still water. I am sorry, I said, not knowing what else to say. Do not be, he replied. It was a long time ago. The music swelled, carrying us through the final turns of the waltz, and when it ended, he released me with a small bow and melted back into the crowd. I stood alone in the center of the floor, my heart pounding, feeling as though something important had just occurred but unable to say what it was. Lady Octavia appeared at my elbow. Well done, she murmured. That is the most I have seen him smile in 2 years. I had not noticed him smile, but I did not say so. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of introductions and pleasantries. I met Lord and Lady Pemberton, elderly and kind. I met Sir Geoffrey Aldrich, a widower with a hungry look that made my skin crawl. I met Miss Henrietta Moss, a debutante who simpered and giggled and made me feel impossibly old at 23. And I met, finally, the Honourable Gideon Stanhope, the cousin who stood to inherit everything if the Duke failed to produce an heir. Your Grace, he said, bowing over my hand with exaggerated courtesy. What a pleasure to finally meet the woman who has succeeded where so many have failed. He was handsome in a florid, excessive way, with reddish hair and features that might have been pleasing if they had not been arranged in an expression of perpetual smugness. His eyes traveled over me with undisguised assessment, and I felt a flash of revulsion that I struggled to hide. The pleasure is mine, Mr. Stanhope, I lied. I must confess, he continued, still holding my hand, that I had not believed the rumors. Dorian, married? It seemed impossible. And yet, here you are. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. I do hope you know what you have gotten yourself into, Your Grace. Ravensmoor is not a happy house, and my cousin is not a happy man. I freed my hand with a gentle but firm motion. All houses have their shadows, Mr. Stanhope. I am not afraid of the dark. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps, or respect. No, he said slowly. I do not suppose you are. He bowed again and retreated, leaving me with the uncomfortable feeling that I had made an enemy. The ball concluded shortly after midnight. The guests departed in their carriages, and the servants began the work of returning the ballroom to its usual dormancy. Lady Octavia retired to her chambers, declaring herself exhausted, and I found myself wandering the darkened corridors of Ravensmoor, too restless to sleep. I did not intend to find myself at the door of the East Tower. And yet there I was, standing before a narrow door set into the stone wall, my hand on the latch before I fully understood what I was doing. I should not go in, I told myself. Lady Octavia had warned me. The East Tower was Lavinia's domain, and it had been locked since her death. But the door was not locked. It swung open at my touch, revealing a spiral staircase that climbed into darkness. I hesitated for a long moment, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then I took up a candle from a nearby sconce and began to climb. The staircase was steep and narrow, the steps worn smooth by centuries of feet. As I climbed, the air grew colder until my breath formed small clouds before my face. At last, I emerged into a circular chamber at the top of the tower. It was a beautiful room, or it had been once. The walls were hung with faded silk in what might once have been rose pink, now bleached to a dusty gray by years of neglect. A chaise longue stood near the window, its cushions moth-eaten and sagging. And everywhere there were signs of feminine occupation, a dressing table covered in dust, a wardrobe with its doors hanging open, books and papers scattered across the floor as though someone had left in a great hurry. I moved to the window and looked out. Below me, the gardens of Ravensmoor spread in the moonlight, silver and black, beautiful and terrible. It was a long way down. I thought of Lavinia standing where I now stood, looking out at this same view, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. You should not be here. I spun around, nearly dropping my candle. The Duke stood at the top of the stairs, his face in shadow, his eyes reflecting the flame like a cat's in the darkness. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry. I did not mean to intrude." I was walking, and I found the door open, and I was curious. I stopped, aware that I was babbling. "I will leave." "No," he said, and his voice was strange, softer than I had ever heard it. "Stay." He moved into the room, and I realized he was carrying a bottle of brandy in one hand, already half empty. He crossed to the chaise longue and sat down heavily, staring out the window with an expression I could not read. "This was her room," he said. "I came here sometimes after she died, trying to understand." He laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "I never did. I did not know what to say." I stood frozen by the window, watching him, feeling like an intruder in a private moment of grief. "They think I killed her, you know," he continued. "The whole of England thinks I pushed my wife from this window. But you did not. No." He took a long drink from the bottle. "I was not even here. I was in London, dancing at a ball, while she climbed these stairs and stepped out into the night." He was silent for a moment. "She left a letter." "Did Octavia tell you that?" "No," I whispered. "It was addressed to me." He set the bottle down and reached into his coat, withdrawing a folded piece of paper that had been handled so many times it was soft as cloth. "I carry it with me always. A reminder. May I see it?" I do not know why I asked. It was presumptuous, inappropriate, an invasion of the most private of sorrows. But something in his voice made me bold. Something in the moonlight that streamed through the window and painted us both in shades of silver. He held out the letter without a word, and I took it. The handwriting was feminine and elegant. The ink faded to brown with age. I unfolded it carefully and read the words written there. "My dearest Dorian," it began, "by the time you read this, I will be gone. I know you will blame yourself, but I beg you not to. This choice is my own, as all my choices have been, and the fault lies with me alone. I came to this marriage expecting something you could not give, and when you failed to provide it, I sought it elsewhere. But the truth, which I see now too late, is that what I wanted did not exist. Not with you, not with anyone. The emptiness was in me, not in you. Forgive me for not being strong enough to fill it. Forgive me for leaving you with the burden of my weakness. And know, in whatever way remains possible, that I did love you, even if I could not show it. Lavinia." I folded the letter and handed it back, my hands trembling. "I'm so sorry," I said. "I did not know." "No one does," he replied. He tucked the letter back into his coat and picked up the bottle again. "I keep it secret because it is all I have left of her, all I have left of the truth." He looked at me then, and I saw the tears that he would not allow to fall. "Do you understand now why I did not want to marry again? Why I cannot bear the thought of another woman suffering as she did? She suffered because she was unhappy," I said gently. "Not because of you." "Unhappy because of me," he corrected, "because I could not love her the way she needed, because I was cold and distant and too wrapped up in my own concerns to see that she was drowning." He stood abruptly and crossed to the window, standing so close to me that I could feel the heat of his body through my gown. "I swore I would never do that to another woman," he said. "I swore I would never marry, never risk causing that pain again. And then Octavia found you, and the deadline approached, and I was too weak, too cowardly to refuse." "You are not a coward," I said. "You are a man who has been dealt an impossible hand and is doing his best to play it." He laughed bitterly. "You do not know me, Theodora." It was the first time he had used my name. I felt it like a touch, intimate and unexpected. "Perhaps not," I agreed. "But I know something of impossible hands. I know something of feeling trapped, of seeing no way forward except through the darkness. And I know that you have not broken me yet, Dorian Stanhope. I am stronger than I look." He turned to face me, and in the moonlight I saw something shift behind his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or wonder. "Yes," he said slowly, "I believe you are." We stood there for a long moment, inches apart, the cold air swirling around us, and then, without warning, he reached out and touched my face. His fingers were cold, but the touch itself was gentle, almost reverent. He traced the line of my cheek, the curve of my jaw, as though memorizing my features by feel. "You are not what I expected," he said softly. "Neither are you," I replied. He leaned closer, and I thought for one dizzying moment that he was going to kiss me. But at the last instant he pulled back, dropping his hand and stepping away. "I should go," he said, his voice suddenly brusque. "You should not be up here alone. It is not safe." And he was gone, disappearing down the spiral staircase and leaving me alone in the moonlit tower with the ghost of Lavinia Stanhope and the memory of his touch on my skin. I did not sleep that night. I lay in my enormous bed, staring at the canopy above me, replaying the scene in the tower over and over in my mind. I could still feel his fingers on my face, could still see the tears he had refused to shed, could still hear the crack in his voice when he spoke his dead wife's name. I had come to Ravensmoor for money. I had come for freedom, for escape, for the promise of a life without obligation or constraint. I had not come looking for love. And yet, something was happening to me, something I could not control or explain. The ice around the Duke's heart was beginning to thaw, and I was terrified to discover that my own heart was thawing with it. The days after the ball were different. The Duke did not retreat to his study as he had before. He joined me for breakfast, silent but present. He walked with me in the gardens, pointing out the roses that had been his mother's favorites, the fountain where he had played as a child. He sat with me in the evenings by the fire, reading while I embroidered, and sometimes I would look up to find him watching me with an expression I could not decipher. We did not speak of the tower, of the letter, of the moment when his hand had touched my face, but the memory hung between us, invisible and inescapable, changing everything. Lady Octavia noticed the shift. "He is coming alive again," she said to me one afternoon, her voice hushed with something like hope. "I have not seen him like this in years. Whatever you are doing, do not stop." "I am not doing anything," I protested. She smiled, perhaps not consciously. "But your presence is working on him, Theodora. You are reaching him in ways none of us could." I did not know how to respond. I was still not certain what I wanted, still not certain if my feelings were real or simply a product of proximity and loneliness. But I could not deny that I looked forward to seeing him each morning, that my pulse quickened when he entered a room, that his rare smiles had become precious to me in ways I could not articulate. And then came the night of the Christmas Eve dinner. Lady Octavia had invited a small number of guests to celebrate the season, and the house had been decorated with holly and ivy and great boughs of evergreen that filled the air with the scent of pine. A fire roared in the great hall, and candles burned in every window, and for the first time since my arrival, Ravensmoor felt truly alive. The guests were congenial, the food excellent, the wine flowing freely. I sat beside the Duke at the head of the table and felt for the first time like we might be something more than strangers sharing a roof. After dinner, someone suggested carols, and the party retired to the music room where a pianoforte waited. Lady Octavia played, her fingers dancing over the keys, and the company sang with varying degrees of skill and enthusiasm. The Duke stood by the window, watching me with those pale eyes, and when the final carol ended, he crossed to where I stood. "Walk with me," he said. I took his arm without hesitation, and we slipped out of the music room and into the darkened corridor beyond. He led me through the house, past rooms I had come to know and rooms I had never seen, until we reached a door that opened onto a small balcony overlooking the gardens. Snow had begun to fall, soft and silent, blanketing the world in white. "It is beautiful," I breathed. "Yes," he agreed. but he was not looking at the snow. "Theodora," he said, and the sound of my name on his lips sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the cold. "I must tell you something." I turned to face him, my heart pounding. "What is it?" He took a breath, and I saw that his hands were trembling. "When I agreed to this marriage," he said slowly, "I believed it would be simple, a transaction, a legal arrangement that would satisfy the terms of my grandfather's will, and nothing more. I believed that I could keep my heart locked away, that I could go through the motions of matrimony without ever truly being a husband." He paused, and when he continued, his voice was raw. I was wrong. I stared at him, afraid to hope, afraid to breathe. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that you have broken through walls I thought impenetrable. I am saying that I watch you when you think I am not looking. I am saying that the sound of your laughter is the first beautiful thing I have heard in years." He reached out and took my hands in his, and I felt the trembling in his fingers. "I am saying, Theodora, that I believe I am falling in love with you." The words hung in the cold air between us, fragile as the snowflakes drifting past. "Dorian," I whispered. "You do not have to respond," he said quickly. "I know this was not what you wanted. I know you came here for the money, for your freedom, and I have no right to ask anything more. But I could not go another day without telling you the truth." I looked up at him, at the snow catching in his dark hair, at the vulnerability in his pale eyes, and I knew. "The truth," I said softly, "is that I have been falling too. From the moment I read Lavinia's letter, from the moment you touched my face in the tower, perhaps even before that, from the first time I saw you standing at the window with all that sorrow in your eyes." I squeezed his hands. "I did not want this. I did not ask for it. But I cannot pretend it is not happening." He stared at me as though I had spoken in a language he had forgotten. "You mean it?" "I mean it." And then he kissed me. It was not the chaste brush of lips he had given me at our wedding. It was a real kiss, deep and desperate, full of everything he had been holding back for so long. His hands came up to cradle my face, and I melted into him, into his warmth, into the reality of him. And the snow swirled around us like a blessing. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, our foreheads pressed together, our breath mingling in the cold air. "I do not deserve you," he murmured. "Perhaps not," I agreed, "but you have me anyway." He laughed, a genuine laugh, warm and surprised, and the sound of it was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. We stayed on that balcony until our fingers grew numb and the snow had dusted our hair with white. And when we finally returned to the music room, hand in hand, Lady Octavia took one look at us and burst into tears. "At last," she whispered. "At last." The weeks that followed were the happiest of my life. The Duke, my Dorian, transformed before my eyes. The coldness that had defined him melted away, replaced by a warmth I had never imagined him capable of. He laughed freely, smiled often, and touched me at every opportunity, as though reassuring himself that I was real. We rode together through the snow-covered fields. We read aloud to each other by the fire. We danced in the empty ballroom, just the two of us, waltzing through the shadows while the chandeliers watched overhead. And at night, he came to me through the connecting door. Our marriage became real in every sense of the word. And though I had never expected to find passion within its walls, I discovered it in abundance, in his arms, in his kisses, in the way he whispered my name like a prayer in the darkness. "I love you," he told me one night, his body curved around mine, his breath warm against my neck. "I did not believe I could love again, but you have proven me wrong. I love you too," I replied. More than I knew was possible. We were happy, we were healing, and I began to believe that the future I had never dared to imagine might actually be within reach. But happiness, I have learned, is a fragile thing. And just when we begin to trust it, fate, so often intervenes. It was a cold January morning when the letter arrived. I was sitting in the breakfast room, Dorian beside me, when Pemberton appeared with a silver salver bearing a single envelope. The Duke took it without interest, but I saw his expression change as he read the return address. "What is it?" I asked. He did not answer immediately. He opened the letter, scanned its contents, and his face went pale. "Theodora," he said, and his voice was strange. "There is something you must know." He handed me the letter, and I read it with growing horror. It was from a solicitor in London, informing the Duke that a certain Mr. Cornelius Fitch had made inquiries regarding the whereabouts of one Miss Theodora Blackwell, lately of Whitmore, believed to be residing somewhere in the north of England. Mr. Fitch claimed that Miss Blackwell was engaged to him by legal contract and that her disappearance constituted a breach of promise. He demanded her immediate return, along with damages for the injury to his reputation. My past had found me at last. I dropped the letter, my hands shaking. "Dorian," I said, "I can explain." "There is nothing to explain," he replied, and to my surprise, his voice was calm. "You told me you were running from an arranged marriage. I did not ask for details then, and I do not require them now." He took my hands in his. "This man has no claim on you. You are my wife, the Duchess of Ashworth. No solicitor's letter can change that. But the contract," I whispered, "my father signed it." "Contracts can be broken," Dorian said firmly. "Especially contracts that were made under duress, without the consent of the woman involved." He lifted my hands to his lips and kissed them. "I will not let him take you, Theodora. I swear it on my life." He was true to his word. That very afternoon, he dispatched a letter to his own solicitors in London, instructing them to deal with Mr. Fitch and his claims. He wrote to barristers, to judges, to anyone with the power to quash the threat, and through it all, he remained by my side, steady and sure. But the trouble was not yet over. A fortnight later, Mr. Cornelius Fitch himself arrived at Ravensmoor. I was in the garden, cutting early snowdrops for a vase, when I heard the crunch of wheels on the drive. I looked up to see a carriage approaching, black and severe, and something in my chest clenched with premonition. By the time I reached the front door, Dorian was already there, facing down a man I had hoped never to see again. Cornelius Fitch was exactly as I remembered him, thin and gray, with eyes like chips of ice and hands that never stopped moving, plucking at his cuffs, adjusting his cravat. He was dressed in expensive clothing that did not quite fit, the mark of new money trying too hard to look like old. "Your Grace," he was saying as I approached, "I mean no offense. I simply wish to discuss this matter like civilized men." "There is nothing to discuss," Dorian replied. His voice was colder than I had ever heard it. "Miss Blackwell is my wife. Any agreement you believed you had with her father is null and void." Fitch's eyes narrowed. "With respect, Your Grace, that is not for you to decide. The contract was signed in good faith. Money changed hands. I have legal recourse." "Then pursue it," Dorian said. "Take your case to court. I will bury you in litigation until your grandchildren are gray." Something ugly flickered across Fitch's face. "You are making a mistake, Your Grace. I am not a man to be trifled with." "And I am not a man to be threatened," Dorian replied. He stepped forward, using his height to loom over the smaller man. "Leave my property, Mr. Fitch, and do not return." Fitch held his ground for a moment longer, his eyes darting to me where I stood in the doorway. Then he smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression that made my skin crawl. "As you wish," he said. "But this is not over." He climbed back into his carriage and departed, but his words hung in the air like a curse. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in Dorian's arms, listening to the wind outside, and I could not shake the feeling that something terrible was coming. "What are you thinking?" Dorian asked, his voice soft in the darkness. "I am afraid," I admitted. Fitch is not a man who gives up easily. He will find a way to hurt us. Dorian tightened his arms around me. He can try, he said, but he will not succeed. I will protect you, Theodora, whatever it takes. I wanted to believe him. But in my heart, I knew that some enemies could not be vanquished with money or influence. Some enemies required sacrifice, and I feared that the sacrifice would be mine. The blow came 2 weeks later in the form of a scandal. I do not know how Fitch discovered my true identity or how he persuaded the newspapers to print his version of events. But suddenly, every paper in England was carrying the story. The Duchess of Ashworth revealed as common-born impostor, Duke's bride, fled debts and legal marriage contract, scandal at Ravensmoor. Was the wedding even legal? The headlines were lurid and sensational, and they painted me as everything I had feared becoming: a fortune hunter, a liar, a woman without honor or breeding who had tricked her way into one of England's great families. Lady Octavia was furious. "This is libel," she declared, waving a newspaper at me. "We will sue. We will destroy them." But I knew better than to think it would be so simple. The damage was done. Society had been given permission to hate me, and society would not waste the opportunity. The invitations stopped. The callers disappeared. When we rode out in the carriage, I saw curtains twitching in windows, heard whispers behind gloved hands. The servants looked at me differently, uncertainty in their eyes, and I knew they were wondering if their new mistress was the villain the papers claimed. Through it all, Dorian remained steadfast. "I do not care what they say," he told me. "You are my wife. You are the woman I love. Nothing they print can change that." But I saw the toll it was taking. I saw the shadows returning to his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the way he flinched when a new edition arrived. He was fighting a war on my behalf, and it was breaking him. I began to think the unthinkable. "Perhaps," I said to him one night, "we should consider an annulment." He looked at me as though I had suggested burning down the house. "Never," he said. "Do not even speak of it." "But think of what this is costing you," I pleaded. "Your reputation, your standing, your peace of mind. I brought this trouble to your door. Perhaps it would be better if I simply left." He took my face in his hands, his eyes fierce. "Listen to me," he said. "I spent 2 years living in darkness. I spent 2 years believing that I would never feel anything again. And then you came, and you brought light back into my life. You think I would trade that for the good opinion of strangers? You think I would choose reputation over love?" He kissed me hard. "You are not leaving. Not now. Not ever." His words should have comforted me. But as I lay in his arms that night, I knew that something would have to give. The siege could not continue forever. Someone would have to break. The resolution came from an unexpected quarter. It was a gray February afternoon when a carriage arrived bearing a crest I did not recognize. A woman descended, tall and elegant, her silver hair arranged beneath a hat of black feathers. She was perhaps 60 years old, and she carried herself with the bearing of an empress. "The Dowager Countess of Hadley," Pemberton announced as she swept into the drawing room where I waited with Lady Octavia. I rose to curtsy, confused. I had never heard of the Countess of Hadley, and I could not imagine what she might want with us. But Lady Octavia had gone pale. "Aunt Marguerite," she said, "what are you doing here?" The Dowager fixed her with a withering stare. "I am here because my family is in disgrace, and no one seems capable of resolving the situation." She turned to me, her sharp eyes taking my measure. "So, you are the girl who has caused all this trouble." I lifted my chin. "I am the Duchess of Ashworth," I replied. "If there has been trouble, I assure you I did not seek it." The Dowager studied me for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. "Good," she said. "Spine. That is what this family needs." She settled herself into a chair without waiting for an invitation. "Now, tell me everything." And so I did. I told her about Fitch, about the contract, about my flight from my father's house. I told her about Lady Octavia's offer, about the arrangement, about the slow, surprising growth of genuine love between Dorian and myself. I told her about the letter in the tower, about Lavinia, about the guilt that had imprisoned my husband for so long. When I finished, the dowager was silent for a long moment. "You love him," she said at last. It was not a question. "I do. And he loves you." "He does." She nodded slowly. "Then there is only one course of action." She rose from her chair with surprising agility for a woman of her years. "Society will not accept you as you are. Your origins are too scandalous, your history too convenient a target. But there is one thing that can silence even the most vicious gossips." "What is that?" I asked. "A child," the dowager replied, "an heir. The moment you produce a son, all will be forgiven. The line will be secured, the succession will be clear, and even your worst enemies will be forced to acknowledge your place." I stared at her, feeling the blood rush to my cheeks. "But I do not know if such a thing is possible," I said. "We have only been truly married for a few months." The dowager smiled, and there was something almost kind in the expression. "Time will tell," she said. "But in the meantime, I intend to do my part." She turned to Lady Octavia. "Send out invitations for a ball, here, at Ravensmoor, in 1 month's time. I will personally ensure that every family of consequence attends." "But the scandal," Lady Octavia protested. "The scandal is precisely why they will come," the dowager replied. "Everyone loves a spectacle, and when they arrive, they will find the new Duchess gracious, charming, and utterly impossible to dismiss. We will give them nothing to criticize, no grounds for gossip. And when the dust settles, Theodora will have taken her place at the heart of society, and that wretched moneylender will find himself without allies or ammunition." It was a bold plan. It was perhaps an impossible plan. But as I looked at the Dowager Countess, at the steel in her eyes and the set of her jaw, I felt something I had not felt in weeks. Hope. The month that followed was a whirlwind of preparation. Lady Octavia threw herself into the arrangements with renewed energy, and the Dowager proved as formidable an ally as she had promised. Invitations went out, carefully worded to suggest both exclusivity and inevitability. The house was cleaned from top to bottom, the gardens groomed, the chandeliers polished until they blazed, and I prepared for the performance of my life. The Dowager coached me relentlessly. Posture, conversation, the precise angle of a smile, the weight of a pause. She drilled me on names and histories and the intricate web of obligations that bound the aristocracy together. By the end, I felt less like a woman and more like a weapon, honed to a razor's edge. Dorian watched all of this with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You do not have to do this," he told me the night before the ball. "We could leave, go abroad. Let them have their gossip while we build a life somewhere else." I took his face in my hands, as he had taken mine so many times before. "I am not running anymore," I said. "This is my home now. You are my home, and I will fight for it." He kissed me then, long and deep, and when we broke apart, there were tears in his eyes. "I do not deserve you," he whispered. "You keep saying that," I replied, "and I keep proving you wrong." The ball was a triumph. I descended the grand staircase on Dorian's arm, wearing a gown of gold silk that the Dowager had personally selected, my hair piled high and threaded with diamonds. Every eye in the room turned to watch us, and I saw what they expected to see. A fraud, a fortune hunter, a woman playing at being a duchess. I gave them something else. I was gracious. I was charming. I remembered every name, every face, every detail of conversation. I danced with earls and viscounts and even the Bishop of Wessex. I complimented Lady Pemberton on her new gown. I inquired after Sir Geoffrey's hunting dogs. I laughed at jokes that were not funny and smiled at insults disguised as compliments, and through it all, I never once lost my composure. By midnight, the tide had turned. I could feel it in the way people looked at me, the way they spoke. The whispers had taken on a different quality. "She is remarkable," I heard one matron say to another. "Such poise, such elegance. One would never know she was not born to this." It was not exactly a compliment, but it was close enough. The evening's final act came when Gideon Stanhope approached me during a pause in the dancing. "Your Grace," he said, bowing with exaggerated courtesy, "I must congratulate you. You have managed a remarkable recovery." I smiled at him, all sweetness and steel. "I do not know what you mean, Mr. Stanhope." There was nothing to recover from. His eyes narrowed. "The papers suggested otherwise." "The papers," I replied, "will print anything that sells. Surely a man of your intelligence knows better than to believe everything he reads." He stared at me for a long moment, and I saw calculation behind his eyes. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. "You are wasted on my cousin," he said. "You should have been a politician." "Perhaps," I agreed. "But I find I prefer being a duchess." I turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the middle of the ballroom. The victory was complete. In the weeks that followed, the invitations began to return. Slowly at first, then in a flood. The scandal faded from the papers, replaced by fresher outrages. And when, in late spring, I discovered that I was carrying Dorian's child, even the most stubborn skeptics were forced to admit that the Stanhope succession was secure. The dowager declared herself satisfied. "You have done well," she told me on the day she departed for London. "Better than I expected. The child will seal your place beyond question." "Thank you," I said, "for everything." She waved a dismissive hand. "I did not do it for you," she replied. "I did it for the family." But she smiled as she said it, and I understood that the two things had become, in her mind, the same. Dorian was transformed by the news of my pregnancy. The last shadows lifted from his eyes, replaced by a joy so profound it seemed to illuminate him from within. He hovered over me constantly, concerned about every twinge, every moment of fatigue. He read aloud to my belly in the evenings, his voice low and tender, convinced that the child could hear him. "We will name him Edward," he declared one night, "if it is a boy, after my father. And if it is a girl?" He smiled. "Then we will name her Theodora, after the bravest woman I have ever known." I laughed and kissed him, and in that moment, I believed that all our troubles were behind us. But there was still one final trial to face. It came in the form of a letter, delivered on a warm June morning, bearing my father's handwriting. I stared at the envelope for a long moment before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in the cramped, unsteady script I remembered from my childhood. "My dear Theodora," it began, "I have heard of your marriage and your success. I cannot pretend to understand how you achieved such a remarkable elevation, but I am glad of it. Your mother died last month. She asked for you at the end. I thought you should know. Your father, Reginald Blackwell." I read the words twice before they penetrated. My mother was dead. The woman who had turned away when I begged for help. The woman who had chosen silence over salvation. The woman I had not seen or spoken to in nearly a year. She was gone, and her final words had been my name. I did not know what to feel. Dorian found me an hour later, still sitting in the garden, the letter crumpled in my hands. "Theodora," he said, sinking to his knees beside me. "What is it? What has happened?" I handed him the letter without speaking. He read it, and his expression shifted from concern to understanding. "I am so sorry," he said softly. "I do not know if I am," I replied. My voice sounded strange, distant. "She abandoned me when I needed her most. She let my father sell me like livestock. And yet she was still your mother," Dorian finished. Yes. He gathered me into his arms, and I allowed myself to lean against him, to draw strength from his warmth. "It is possible," he said gently, "to grieve for someone even when you are still angry with them. It is possible to mourn what could have been, even when you know it never was." I thought of Lavinia. I thought of the letter in the tower. I thought of all the complicated, impossible tangles of love and resentment that bind families together. "How do you do it?" I asked. "How do you carry all of it?" "One day at a time," he replied, "and not alone. Never alone." I pressed my face into his chest and let the tears come at last. My son was born on a stormy October night, exactly 1 year after I had stumbled into Lady Octavia's carriage and found my fate waiting in the darkness. The labor was long and difficult, but I endured it, as I had endured everything else, with determination and the knowledge that Dorian was waiting just beyond the door. And when the midwife finally placed my child in my arms, red-faced and squalling and perfect, I understood at last what all of it had been for. Edward Reginald Stanhope, heir to the Ashworth dukedom, came into the world screaming, and I laughed through my tears at the sound. Dorian entered moments later, his face pale with fear and hope, and when he saw us, mother and son tangled together in the bloodied sheets, he fell to his knees beside the bed. "He is perfect," he whispered. "You are perfect, both of you." I looked at my husband, at the tears streaming down his face, at the wonder in his eyes, and I knew that this was the moment everything had been building toward. All the pain, all the uncertainty, all the struggle and sacrifice had brought us here, to this room, to this child, to this love that had grown from the most unlikely of seeds. "I love you," I told him. "And I you," he replied. "More than life, more than anything." He climbed onto the bed beside me, careful not to disturb the baby, and wrapped his arms around us both. And as the storm raged outside and the candles flickered in their sconces, I felt a peace so deep and complete that it seemed to suffuse every atom of my being. We stayed like that for a long time, the three of us, a family forged from chaos and circumstance and the stubborn refusal to surrender. And though I knew there would be more challenges ahead, more trials to face, and more obstacles to overcome, I also knew that we would face them together. Because that is what love is, in the end. Not the absence of hardship, but the presence of someone willing to weather it with you. Not perfection, but partnership. Not the fairy tale ending we dream of as children, but something better, something realer. A life built day by day, choice by choice, from the raw materials of two imperfect hearts learning to beat as one. I did not find my fate in Lady Octavia's carriage that stormy night. I found only opportunity. The fate I built myself, one decision at a time, from the ashes of everything I had lost. And that, I have come to understand, is the truest kind of destiny there is. The first years of Edward's life passed in a haze of golden happiness that I had never dared to believe possible. Ravensmoor, which had once seemed so cold and forbidding, transformed into a home filled with laughter and warmth. I watched my son take his first steps across the ancient stone floors. I heard his first words echo through the corridors where generations of Stanhopes had lived and loved and died. And with each passing season, I felt the last vestiges of my former life falling away, replaced by something stronger and more permanent. Lady Octavia became the aunt Edward had never had, doting on him with an intensity that bordered on the absurd. She brought him gifts from London on every visit, taught him to play chess before he could properly hold the pieces, and defended him fiercely against any criticism, real or imagined. Watching her with my son, I understood at last why she had gone to such extraordinary lengths to save her brother. Family, for Octavia, was not merely a matter of blood. It was a sacred obligation, a duty that superseded all other considerations. The Dowager Countess visited rarely but memorably, sweeping into Ravensmoor with her silver hair and her sharp eyes, examining Edward as though he were a particularly promising racehorse. But I saw the softness that crept into her expression when she thought no one was watching, the way her fingers lingered on his curls when she bid him goodbye. Even the ice queen of the aristocracy, it seemed, was not immune to the charms of a child. Dorian, of course, was transformed utterly by fatherhood. The man who had once stood at windows staring into the distance now spent hours on the nursery floor, building towers of blocks and narrating elaborate adventures for Edward's collection of toy soldiers. He read bedtime stories with theatrical flair, doing voices for each character until Edward collapsed into giggles. And when our son fell ill with a fever one winter, Dorian sat by his bedside for 3 days and nights without sleeping, refusing to leave until the crisis had passed. "You will make yourself ill," I chided him gently, pressing a cup of tea into his hands. "I cannot lose him," he replied, and the rawness in his voice told me that he was not speaking only of Edward. He was speaking of Lavinia, of the child they had never had, of all the losses that had shaped him into the man he was. "You will not lose him," I promised. "You will not lose any of us." And I meant it with every fiber of my being. The years brought changes beyond our little family as well. Gideon Stanhope, his hopes of inheriting the estate dashed by Edward's birth, retreated to the continent, where rumor had it he was gambling away what remained of his fortune in the casinos of Monte Carlo. I could not bring myself to feel sorry for him. He had been an obstacle, a threat, a reminder of everything we had almost lost. His absence was a relief, pure and simple. Cornelius Fitch met a grimmer fate. Word reached us one autumn that he had been arrested for fraud, his schemes finally catching up with him. He died in debtor's prison before his trial could conclude, a pathetic end to a pathetic man. When I received the news, I felt nothing but a distant, clinical satisfaction. He had tried to own me, to control me, to reduce me to nothing more than a payment on a debt. And he had failed. My father wrote again, once, after Fitch's death. He claimed he had not known the full extent of the arrangement, that he had been deceived by the moneylender's promises. He asked for money, of course. They always ask for money. I did not respond. Dorian offered to do it for me, to write a letter that would sever the connection once and for all. But I found that I no longer needed such gestures. My father had ceased to matter. He was a figure from another life, a cautionary tale I would one day tell my children about the dangers of weakness and greed. But he was not my concern, not anymore. I had built a new family, a better family, and that was all that mattered. When Edward was 5, I gave birth to our second child, a daughter with her father's dark hair and my own stubborn chin. We named her Rosalind, after the heroine of a play Dorian had read aloud to me during my confinement, and she proved to be as spirited as her namesake from the moment she drew breath. Where Edward was thoughtful and serious, Rosalind was wild and fearless. She climbed trees before she could write her name. She terrorized the stable cats. She once convinced her brother to help her stage an escape from the nursery using a rope made of knotted bedsheets, a plan that ended with both of them stuck in the branches of an oak tree and half the household staff in a panic. "She is going to be the death of me," Dorian declared one evening after Rosalind had been retrieved from yet another unauthorized adventure. But he was smiling as he said it, the exasperated smile of a father who cannot help but admire his daughter's spirit even as he despairs of controlling it. "She is exactly like you," I replied. He stared at me in genuine confusion. I was never this troublesome as a child. I laughed so hard I nearly fell off my chair, because I had seen the portraits in the gallery. I had heard the stories from Lady Octavia. I knew perfectly well that Dorian Stanhope had been a hellion in his youth, climbing where he was not supposed to climb, exploring where he was not supposed to explore, getting into scrapes that had turned his mother's hair gray before its time. "Rosalind," I said, wiping tears of mirth from my eyes, "is your just punishment for everything you put your own parents through." He grumbled, but he did not argue. And that night, when he thought I was asleep, I heard him slip into the nursery and whisper to our sleeping daughter, telling her stories of his own childhood adventures and promising to teach her all the best hiding spots in the house. I pretended not to notice. Some secrets between father and daughter are sacred. The East Tower remained locked for many years. I had not returned there since that moonlit night when Dorian had shown me Lavinia's letter, and I had no desire to revisit those memories. The past was buried there, along with all the sorrow and guilt that Dorian had carried for so long, and I saw no reason to disturb it. But time, as they say, heals all wounds. And one spring afternoon, when Edward was 8 and Rosalind 6, Dorian came to me with a strange expression on his face. "I want to show you something," he said. He led me through the corridors I knew so well, up the narrow staircase, to the door I had not opened in nearly a decade. But when he pushed it open, I gasped. The tower room had been transformed. The faded silk hangings were gone, replaced by cheerful wallpaper in a pattern of climbing roses. The moth-eaten furniture had been cleared away, making room for 2 small desks, a pair of comfortable chairs, and shelves lined with books and toys. Sunlight streamed through the windows, warm and golden, and where there had once been the atmosphere of a tomb, there was now only light and life. "I have been working on it for months," Dorian said quietly. "With the servants' help. I wanted to surprise you." "But why?" I asked, still taking in the transformation. "Because this room has been haunted long enough," he replied. "Because Lavinia is gone, and holding on to the darkness cannot bring her back." He took my hand, his fingers warm and steady. I thought perhaps the children could use it as a playroom, a place for their lessons, their games, a place where they can look out over Ravensmoor and dream of the future instead of the past. I turned to look at him, at this man who had spent so many years imprisoned by his grief, and I saw that he had finally set himself free. "It is perfect," I said, and I kissed him there, in the tower room that had once been a shrine to sorrow and was now a temple to hope. The children adored their new playroom. Edward filled the shelves with his growing collection of scientific specimens, fossils and pressed flowers, and the skull of a badger he had found in the woods. Rosalind claimed the best window seat for her own, from which she could survey her kingdom and plan her next adventure. They spent hours there, reading and playing and quarreling and making peace again, as siblings have done since the beginning of time. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, Dorian and I would climb the stairs together and sit in the comfortable chairs by the window, watching the sun set over the gardens and listening to the echo of children's laughter fading into sleep. "We are so lucky," I said to him one such evening. He nodded, his hand finding mine in the gathering dusk. "We are," he agreed, "and we earned every moment of it." I thought about that often in the years that followed, about luck and fortune and the strange alchemy that transforms disaster into destiny. I had stepped into the wrong carriage on a stormy night, frightened and alone, running from a future I could not face. And now I sat in a tower room with my husband, our children dreaming peacefully below, surrounded by the evidence of a life I had never imagined possible. Was it luck? Was it fate? Was it simply the random collision of chance events that had conspired to bring me here? I did not know. Perhaps I would never know. But I knew this: I would not trade a single moment of it. Not the fear or the uncertainty, not the scandal or the struggle, not even the long nights of doubt when I had wondered if I was making a terrible mistake. Because all of it, every stumble and every triumph, had led me to this moment, to this place, to this man who held my hand in the darkness and called me his heart. That is worth any price, I thought. That is worth everything. The seasons turned, as they always do, and Edward grew from a boy into a young man with his father's serious eyes and his mother's stubborn determination. At 16, he announced his intention to study natural philosophy at Cambridge, a plan that Dorian supported with enthusiasm and I with barely concealed terror. My son, leaving Ravensmoor. My son, venturing out into a world that had once been so cruel to me. But I could not hold him back. I would not. I had learned from my own mother's example. What happens when parents try to control their children's fates instead of guiding them? And so I kissed Edward goodbye on a misty September morning, pressed a letter into his hands that he was not to read until he reached the university, and watched the carriage carry him away until it disappeared over the horizon. The letter said simply, "Be brave, be kind, be true. And come home to us when you can. We will always be here waiting." Rosalind, for her part, showed no inclination toward academia. At 14, she had discovered a passion for horses that rivaled her earlier passion for climbing trees, and she spent more time in the stables than in the schoolroom. Dorian indulged her shamelessly, purchasing a series of increasingly spirited mounts and watching with barely concealed pride as she mastered each one. "She rides like a demon," he reported to me one afternoon, after observing her jump a fence that had defeated riders twice her age. "I am terrified and impressed in equal measure." "She takes after her father," I replied, as I always did. This time, he did not argue. The quiet years, I came to call them, not because nothing happened, but because what happened was gentle and gradual, the slow accretion of memories that builds a life worth living. We celebrated anniversaries and birthdays. We mourned Lady Octavia when she passed peacefully in her sleep at the age of 72, and we planted a garden in her memory filled with the roses she had loved. We welcomed Edward home for holidays, marveling at the man he was becoming. We watched Rosalind win her first steeplechase, and then her second, and then so many more that we lost count. And through it all, Dorian and I held fast to each other, two souls who had found their way through darkness to light. "You know," he said to me one evening, as we walked together in the garden where we had walked so many times before, "I used to believe that happiness was something that happened to other people, that I was marked for sorrow, destined to spend my days in shadow." "And now?" I asked. He stopped walking and turned to face me, his silver-streaked hair gleaming in the moonlight. "Now I know that happiness is a choice," he said. "It is not given to us. We must reach for it, fight for it, build it with our own hands from whatever materials we are given." He took my face in his hands, the gesture so familiar it felt like coming home. "And I choose you, Theodora. Every day, in every moment, I choose you." I kissed him then, as I had kissed him thousands of times before, and still it felt like the first time. "I choose you too," I whispered against his lips. "Always." We stood there in the moonlit garden, two people who had traveled such a long and winding road to find each other, and we were at peace. Years later, when Edward was old enough to understand, I told him the story of how his father and I came to be. I told him about the wrong carriage and the unexpected proposal, about the tower and the letter and the long, slow journey from strangers to lovers. I told him about his grandmother's death and his grandfather's failures, and the cousin who had wanted to steal everything his father had built. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked when I finished. "Because I want you to know," I replied, "that life does not always go according to plan. Sometimes the path we thought we wanted leads nowhere, and the path we stumbled onto by accident leads to everything we never knew we needed." He was silent for a long moment, considering my words with the serious intensity that reminded me so much of his father. "Do you regret it?" he asked finally. "Any of it?" I smiled and drew him close. "Not for a single moment," I said. "Every wrong turn, every mistake, every heartbreak brought me here. Brought me to your father. Brought me to you." He hugged me then, fierce and sudden, and I held him tight, this miracle child who was the living proof of everything Dorian and I had built together. Outside the window, the gardens of Ravensmoor stretched in the afternoon light, green and gold and impossibly beautiful. I could see Dorian walking among the roses, his dark hair now threaded with silver, his steps slower than they once were but still sure. He looked up and saw us watching, and his face broke into a smile that made him look, for an instant, like the young man who had touched my face in a moonlit tower and confessed that he was learning to love again. He waved, and Edward waved back, and I felt my heart swell with a gratitude too vast for words. I had taken the wrong carriage on the night I was meant to disappear forever, and in doing so, I had found my way home.